engage with the world, regardless of whether we're with a family that represents who we are or one that's pretty far the opposite. And
Yes,
so you just have to learn how to work with it, and you got to live with it, and you can, if you're willing to, you can make it happen and make it effective and efficient.
precisely. And thank you, Comedy Central, for posting all your stuff on YouTube now for anyone to with internet to freely watch. And with
Yes.
that, I welcome everyone to the Burning Bush podcast. This is episode number 8. Um, and I guess it is I, OnGoCast, as always, and I'm joined with my co-host Kevin here. How you
Yes.
doing?
I'm doing well, just chilling here. Had to live up to the name of the stream, burned some bush before we started, and I'm already feeling it. I'm already feeling the vibe, and I'm ready to get into a conversation about some interesting topics this week. How are you doing
Yeah,
this? How are you doing tonight, Chris?
I'm doing well. I definitely have looked at a lot of potential topics this week, but again, uh, I wanted to keep it less about what we've been going through because we were talking our viewer Taz last week about how every week there seems to be something new, and not that it has a diminished meaning, but it does seem like you don't even have to look for news anymore. It just comes right at you. But
Yeah,
before I get into that, I'll just talk about my little pup Rukia. She's doing well. She's finally learning to not be a crazy psychopath, um,
that's
which
good.
is nice.
That is good.
And so she's slowly adapting to being without any sort of block, door, that sort of things, and she won't like wander around and dig up fake moss from like the fake plants, potted plants, and that kind of stuff.
Good.
So
She's
that's getting
figuring it
getting
out.
better. She's figuring it
Getting
out. She's
maturing a little bit more, getting more used to the environment.
she's still a literal bitch though. um,
Yeah, yeah.
and
They're
that's
wild
to be
for a while.
expected. So a bitch do what a bitch gonna do,
She'll
and I
be a
can't
puppy
blame her
for
for
a
being a
couple more
bitch.
years still.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so. She's almost lost all her baby teeth, which is nice, and less, not completely stopped, but chewing on stuff. But yeah, I guess for our intro, it would be fair to kind of stay relevant with the times, date us, so to speak. And first thing that comes to mind is, of course, thinking back at last week. The thing we ended off with was statistics about gun violence. And there was the whole thing that happened in Kenosha, and
Yeah,
that's definitely something huge. Like I said, I don't want to make this into another episode 5 or whatever that was, but just be aware and um beware of all the details and whatnot. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I just wanted to mention that was probably a major thing that happened this week.
yeah. I mean,
Uh,
it's obviously just the whole situation that's occurred since Jacob Blake was shot in the back. That whole confrontation situation obviously was a horrible situation that shouldn't have happened the way it happened, and obviously people have retaliated and responded in a variety of ways, some significantly more helpful than others. But specifically, in regards to what happened a number of days ago, um, with an individual who doesn't need to be named necessarily, who committed a crime and took the lives of two people and injured another. Regardless of what side you stand on, whether you believe that he was in the right and he was defending himself from people who were antagonizing him because of what he believed or that they didn't agree with him, or you know um, you know be it something else. It's just a very intense, and it was a very explosive situation. Obviously, a lot of people are still really upset about it. A lot of people really want, the charges that have been brought against him to, follow through, because, that could potentially lead to him being in life, or being in prison for life, which is obviously a pretty big change for him, considering he's a 17-year-old who probably isn't even done with high school.
Yeah,
Doesn't
I didn't want to get too into this because
sure.
obviously I've spoke to you about this, Kevin. I think the opposite's going to happen. I think he's going to get off pretty scot free, in the case of self defense. But the idea is still the same, that any loss of life outside of, I don't even know if external conflict is justifiable anymore, but the idea that we are all citizens within our own country, we're all Americans, um, at the base of it, so we shouldn't be infighting. And the Civil War was a horrifying event in which it's the largest loss of American life in any war we've been in, because it was literally both sides. So I think the idea here, regardless of whether you hold a certain view or not about this situation, is that we should stand together rather than divide.
Yeah, I mean, it's just obviously turned into a thing where it's not even about the fact that people died. It's not even the fact that he killed somebody. It's like turning into a political event now. It's turning into a thing where people are like defending him or getting behind him. Or like certain parties are, and it's just like obviously not something that it needs to be. So it's definitely become something more than it needed to be. And
Yeah, I think my main takeaway from this uh, is that rioting and looting hurts both sides. That's, I mean, I don't think that's the right way to respond. And I have to differentiate protesting from those two things, because the idea of protesting is not to incite some sort of repercussion due to physical actions you've taken, aside from peaceful assembly, things that are protected in our, and this is why I didn't want to go into it, because it's like we can just keep on talking about it for the whole episode. But uh I think that violence begets violence. So
it does.
when protests devolve into rioting, and more specifically looting and destruction of property, that's not okay, no matter who it is, because we've proven that the 1%, those types of people, can be touched. Um, and I don't mean like in the Jeff Epstein sort of way, but like there have been people like Bernie Madoff that have thought they were gods and didn't get away with it. But the idea that the only way to succeed in destroying the bourgeoisie is to destroy the things that provide income, which, in my opinion, regardless of any connotation of socialism or anything of that, um, the fact that we live in a capitalistic society and that's what our our country's based off of, is, it just to me seems counterproductive to destroy property when that is like what our country is valued off of,
Well,
regardless of if it's for a good cause, which I don't think there is. Like, regardless of how corrupt whatever organization you're trying to attack, like in this specific case, let's say a dealership or a gas station, who are the people that own those things? It's not like some mega corporation. It's usually the manager that runs it, and it's his problem. So it's kind of like these major political views being brought down on specific
I feel like often
microcosms.
when people are looting, it doesn't have anything to do with like the economic, like social aspect of it. I feel like that's just people taking advantage of the fact that there's already intense conflict going on in regards to protest. It doesn't even need to be conflict necessarily, but just like a large assemblage of people doing something, and people take advantage of that. And
Yeah,
then, it ends up with all the protesters being labeled and stereotyped and classified as people who are just going around destroying things and, taking advantage of people and seeking to, you know, just make the moment theirs instead of one that serves everybody. And it's not really helpful for anybody. And yeah, it's it's just
I'm
not,
completely
not good.
against it. I love protesting. I think that's fine, but once it devolves into violence and destruction, that's where I lose interest. But if you were to play devil's advocate, what would the justifications be behind these sorts of things? Like getting into the mind of the people who
Well,
throw bricks at car dealerships and burn down buildings.
so like obviously in regards to like, so I mean I don't want to get too political, but like personally I tend to align myself with people who have a more socialistic perspective on things. And as such, I tend to believe that people should be. I mean, I don't really. Man, I'm sorry, I'm I'm a little high right now, but I'm just trying
It's
to think.
okay.
Uh, I don't think that it's really helpful to destroy like a small level business, one that serves like, or one that's literally, like you said, locally owned by a couple people or like one person. That doesn't really do anything because that doesn't really necessarily contribute to capitalism. I feel like people who are going about these things with a political or economic and are probably going after ones like corporations and such, which is what a lot of the time you see on like the news or popular news stations and such. Um, but people who are just going out of their way to destroy individuals, businesses, and stuff, that doesn't contribute to anything. That's just people being violent and reacting um, unnecessarily, intensely, and in an over over the top manner. It doesn't contribute to anything or help anyone at the end of
Yeah.
the day.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good way to kind of tie it off so we can move into some of the more exciting and less depressing topics, which are by argument is an insensitive comment of me to make or claim for me to make, considering that some of the people that were affected by our next topic, which is proxy wars,
Yeah.
would say otherwise. But I was trying to find the video you sent me, but apparently it's not my history
I
on
can
our
find
YouTube.
it real quick.
So I just have this.
Let me die in peace. I'm perfect. I'm too perfect. This is what happens when you try to play God.
What is that from? That's silly.
Did you put it in the God tier,
I'm,
Kevin?
I'm
Or
going
was it
to.
in... Okay.
Oh, god dang it. Well, you can click on that. Maybe. Didn't it give me the right link?
It's okay. They're just gonna see all this random shit I posted.
Yeah, let me find it.
Oh, God. It's too much stuff. I'm already on yesterday. I'll just look up. What was the network that did it? Was it Vox?
I think so. What if it's yellow? Yeah.
Yeah.
There it is.
There we go.
The Middle East is one of the most
the
complex
sound
regions
things.
in the world. Currently, there are 4 failing states and 3
Thank you
wars,
for Vox for
with major
providing
powers
this on
increasingly
YouTube as
taking
well.
opposite
Yes.
sides.
Monetize this video.
Countless armed
Yes, we do
militias
not
and terrorist
claim
groups are
any
spreading violence
responsibility
across
or
borders.
creative rights to this
The
film.
region has seen conflict after conflict going back well into the 20th century. But among all the uprisings, civil wars, and insurgencies, 2 countries always seem to be involved: Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're bitter rivals, and their feud is the key to understanding conflicts in the Middle East. The Saudis and Iranians have never actually declared war on each other. Instead, they fight indirectly by supporting opposing sides in other countries and inciting conflicts. This is known as proxy warfare, and it's had
I'm
a
already
devastating
lost. Iran and who?
Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
effect on the region. Countries, especially poor ones, can't function if there are larger countries pulling strings within their borders.
All right.
Both the Saudis and the Iranians see these civil wars as both tremendous threats and also potentially enormous opportunities.
The Saudi-Iranian rivalry has become a fight over influence, and the whole region is a battlefield. It's why the rivalry is being called a Cold War.
Perfect time for something else too.
The most famous Cold War was fought for 40 years between the United States and Soviet Union.
Looking forward to the day when their flag would fly over the entire world.
They never declared war on each other, but clashed in proxy wars around the world. Each side supported dictators, rebel groups, and intervened in civil wars to contain the other. Like the US and Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia and Iran are two powerful rivals. But instead,
What were you gonna say?
Oh, I was just saying the Taliban, that's where the Taliban was created, through proxy war with the Mujahideen.
Yeah, the U.S. funded it.
Yeah.
instead of fighting for
Crazy
world
stuff.
dominance, they're fighting over control of the Middle
And then they
East.
fought them.
In
as
order
if they
to
didn't
understand the
create them.
Saudi-Iranian rivalry,
Yeah.
let's go back to the origins of each country. In the early
I don't know
1900s,
if
the
it's
Arabian
blessing the
Peninsula
stream.
was a patchwork of tribes under the control of the Ottoman Empire. After World War
Fine.
I, the empire collapsed, leaving these tribes to fight each other over power. One tribe from the interior, the Al Saud, eventually conquered most of the peninsula. In 1932, they were recognized as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. 6 years
This guy kind of sounds like Napoleon Dynamite.
later, massive oil reserves were discovered in Saudi Arabia, and in an instant the Saudi monarchy was rich.
Vaguely.
That oil money built roads and cities all around the desert country, and it helped forge an alliance with the US. On the eastern side of the Persian Gulf, another country was emerging, but having a much harder time. Iran also had massive oil reserves and an even bigger Muslim population,
Wow.
but constant foreign intervention was
Wow.
creating chaos. Since the 18th century, Iran had been invaded by the Russians and the British twice. In 1953, the US secretly
So the Russians and the British pretty much screwed over Iran because, like, mainland of the peninsula seems much more well off.
Mm,
At least because probably it has Oman over here, the Gulf.
yeah.
Um,
staged a coup, removing the popular
Suez
Prime Minister
Canal, all
Mohammad
that.
Mossadegh. In his place, they propped up a monarch, Reza Shah, who was aggressively reforming Iran into a secular, westernized country. But he harbored corruption and terrorized the population with his secret police, the Savak. By the 19th
it always makes me really sad seeing pictures of mainly women, obviously, because I'm the same, but from Iran, pre the revolution, where they're in bikinis at the beach, and you know,
1970s, both Saudi
Things
Arabia and
changed.
Iran had oil-based
Yeah.
economies and had governments heavily backed by the US. But the feelings among each population were very different.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, the Shah of Iran, powerful as he was, simply didn't have the same control over his people or ultimately the same legitimacy and affection that the Saudi people felt toward their monarchy at that point in time.
That's because Iran's Muslims felt stifled by the Shah's reformations, and by the end of the decade, they finally fought back.
Iran's Islamic Revolution overthrew a powerful regime that boasted military might.
great movie
It's
about
really in
this Zargo.
1979 when
never seen
Ayatollah
it.
Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution
of it,
overthrow
though.
the Shah that the real tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia began.
Ayatollah Khomeini was a Muslim clergyman who preached against Western-backed secular monarchies. He advocated for a government that was popular, Islamic, and led by the clergy. And in 1979, he led a revolution to establish just that. It was a massive international event that prompted reactions around the world, especially in Saudi Arabia.
The Iranian Revolution terrified the government of Saudi Arabia. They were fearful that Ayatollah Khomeini would inspire their populations to rise up against them exactly the way that he had caused the Iranian population to rise up against the Shah.
And there was a religious threat too. Up until now, the Saudis had claimed to be the leaders of the Muslim world, largely because Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, are in Saudi Arabia. But Khomeini claimed his popular revolution made Iran the legitimate Muslim state. And there is another divide. Saudi Arabia's population is mostly Sunni, the majority sect of Islam, while Khomeini and Iran are mostly Shia.
Westerners always make a mistake in drawing an analogy between the Sunni-Shia split and the Protestant-Catholic split within Christianity. The Sunni-Shia split was never as violent. That in much of the Islamic world, when Sunnis and Shia were living in close proximity, they got along famously well.
So while the Sunni-Shia split was not a reason for the rivalry, it was an important division. After the revolution, the Saudis' fears came to life when Iran began exporting its revolution. This CIA report from 1980 details how the Iranians started helping groups, mostly Shia, trying to overthrow governments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia.
And they prompted the Saudis to redouble their efforts to fight against Iran.
They bolstered their alliance with the US and formed the GCC, an alliance with other Gulf monarchies. The stage was set for conflict.
On September the 22nd, Iraqi planes attacked Mehrabad airport outside Tehran. Iraq was gambling on a short, sharp campaign.
The rise of Iran as a regional power threatened other neighboring countries as well. In September 1980, Iraq, under the rule of dictator Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. He was hoping to stop the Iranian Revolution, gain power, and annex some of Iran's oil reserves.
That's
But
crazy.
they didn't get far. The war bogged down into a stalemate, complete with trench warfare, chemical weapons, and heavy civilian casualties. When Iran started winning, the Saudis panicked and came to Iraq's rescue. They provided money, weapons, and logistical help.
And so it becomes critical to the Saudis that they build up Iraq and build it up into a wall that can hold back the Iranian torrent that they have unleashed.
This Saudi help allowed Iraq to fight until 1988. By then, nearly 1 million people had died. The Iranians largely blamed the Saudis for the war, and the feud escalated. Fast forward 15 years, and Iraq again became the scene of a proxy war. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. Neither Saudi Arabia or Iran wanted this to happen, since Iraq had been acting as a buffer between them. But problems arose when the US struggled to replace Saddam.
The United States has no idea what it's doing in Iraq after 2003, and it makes one mistake after another that creates a security vacuum and a failed state and drives Iraq into all-out civil war.
Without a government, armed militias took control of Iraq, splintering the population. Sunni and Shia militias suddenly sprang up all over the country. Many were
I never really
radical
thought
Islamist
about what
groups who
happened
saw-
after he got removed from office.
Yeah, I've watched a lot of former Navy SEALs and people deployed over in Iraq, and a lot of the people there, I mean, the idea there was to, at least for the military, the political aspect of it, you know, you can blame the politicians, not the military, for what they did, but they were there to set up a military force ran by the Iraqis, able to hold off insurgencies and maintain their own fighting ability without our aid. And so from the very beginning, it was actually, that was the whole goal, was maybe not from the very beginning, but from the early occupation after taking down Saddam Hussein, it was the idea of getting out of there, because it's not a valuable asset in terms of really any sort of other view besides oil, in terms of the grand scheme of things, why we invaded and that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
when it came to the soldiers, of course, they're not really to be blamed for being there. And so what they did there is they ended up doing this whole program of, one, teaching the Iraqis to fight for themselves, two, reclaiming major areas that had been taken over by insurgency groups, and that's, I'm guessing, what it's about to lead up to with the extremist groups, and hold those locations. And it's, from at least from the accounts of some of the people that were there for a long period of time, like a lot of the people that were occupied, for the most part, wanted them there. Like they didn't want them to leave, because if they left, then there would have been no military, and Iran would have probably come in and overran, or Saudi Arabia likewise, and changed a lot. But that's one good thing that happened after the Iraq conflict, is that we were able to establish, at least for the most part, ISIS came in and took over the city of Ramadi, which was a major city that took a long time for the U.S. to capture, because they moved building by building. And if you want to learn more, you can watch Jocko Willink's most recent podcast on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he talks about, or maybe it wasn't the most recent, any of his episodes on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think he has 3 now, but he talks about what they did in Ramadi in particular, and how their tactics were to hold one building until it was clear, move to the next one, build it up with sandbags and fortify it, make sure it's clear, move up to the next one. It was a building by building process, because of how deep rooted some of the extremist groups were in the area. It was very difficult to be certain that you were safe without getting surrounded and that sort of thing. So it was a very slow, meticulous process, but that's all a part of a larger proxy war that's going on between these two
Opportunity to gain
countries.
power amidst the chaos. These militias were ready-made proxies for Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they both seized the opportunity to try and gain power. The Saudis started sending money and weapons to the Sunni militias, and Iran the Shia. Iraq was suddenly a proxy war, with Saudi Arabia and Iran supporting opposing sides. That trend continued into the Arab Spring, a series of anti-monarchy, pro-democracy protests that swept through the Middle East in 2011. And this had very different consequences for Saudi Arabia and Iran.
That is terrifying to the Saudis, who are the ultimate status quo power. They want the region stable, and they don't want anybody rising up and overthrowing a sclerotic, autocratic government for fear that it might inspire their own people to do the same. The Iranians are the ultimate anti-status quo power. They have been trying for decades to overturn the regional order.
Each country threw their weight behind different groups, all over the Middle East. Just like in Iraq, the Saudis began supporting Sunni groups and governments, while Iran helped Shia groups rise up against them. For example, in Tunisia, the Saudis backed a dictator while the Iranians stoked protests. In Bahrain, Iran supported Shia leaders seeking to overthrow the government. Saudi Arabia, in turn, sent troops to help quash the unrest. Both got involved in Libya, Lebanon, and Morocco as well. As Saudi Arabia and Iran put more and more pressure on these countries, they began to collapse. Now the feud has gone a step further, with both countries deploying their own militaries. In Yemen, the Saudi military is on the ground helping the central government. They are fighting the rebels called the Houthis, who are an Iranian proxy group. And the reverse is happening in Syria. The Iranian military is fighting side by side with militias, some of them extremist groups like Hezbollah, in support of dictator Bashar al-Assad. They are fighting rebel Sunni groups who are Saudi proxies. The more civil wars that broke out in the Middle East, the more Saudi Arabia and Iran became involved.
Neither
So
the
many
government of
webs.
Saudi Arabia nor the government of Iran are looking for
And it's mind blowing that in this exact one that both sides are deploying militia groups, or not even militia groups, but resistance groups in countries that are being held by a military in the opposing side. So
Yeah.
they're both sending their military and then also sending their insurgents,
Right.
which is something that makes it very difficult for third parties like the US to intervene and or decide like who is who.
Do you feel like
fight.
this is something that I've always sort of had as like a moral quandary? Not to like derail it, but since you said that, do you feel like it's really right and or the responsibility of like Western powers or others to even intervene in these wars that are going on in like
Yes,
in the Middle East?
100%. I don't need to hesitate to say yes or explain why, because the idea that there are organizations out there that are extremist groups that can gain power through influence, such as ISIS. I mean, they took over Iran for a while, and now we've almost eradicated them. If it were not for Western influence, the Middle East could not have done that on their own, and I believe that 100%. If we have the power to destroy things that are that inherently evil, we must do so. I mean, we learned in World War II, isolationism never works. We just wait until we're attacked again. And, 9/11 happened because we got cocky. And all these things happen in Europe because of in my own opinion, I know people will disagree with this. Some will agree, some will disagree, but in my opinion, that's how I feel, is that if you have a presence and there are things out there that are evil, there are people who sign up for the military just for that reason. And so I think that's an important factor. Declaring wars is another issue, but sending troops to fight evil out there is 100% justifiable.
Okay.
How about you, Kevin?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it really, I guess, depends on the situation. I haven't really followed specifically like the histories associated with a lot of like the countries in the Middle East. I've only looked at some of them, but I mean, I just don't really necessarily tend to think that powers which are obviously a lot of the time have their own perspectives and their own motives and drives to do things, and purposes for doing things. I don't necessarily think that it's necessarily their business to get into the issues at hand with other countries are dealing with. Obviously, like, if they're allies or something, it would make sense to like go to the defense or go to the aid of them. But if it's like, I don't know. I guess if it's like,
Okay,
I
Kevin.
mean, I know you.
I'm a huge history buff, so I'd love to pick your brain. In what instance do you think the U.S. has intervened when it was none of their business? I can think of several, so don't worry. I'm not trying to lead you on to something, but what evidence do you have that makes you feel that way?
I mean, I just don't really feel like the U.S. contributed to anything by going to like invading Iraq. Do you really feel like that like contributed
Yeah,
significantly to like the world as it is today? Do you feel like
100%.
nobody could have overthrown Saddam Hussein had the United States not made the move that it did?
I don't think the issue was people wanted him overthrown, aside from okay, I'll look it up because I'm not entirely sure. Who wanted to overthrow I don't know how to spell his name, Saddam. So. Okay. I'm just gonna look up the group that wanted him out, because I don't want to look into some biased news or whatever. And
Understandable.
incarceration, capture, Operation Red Dawn, Turkish, all of Baghdad. Oh, there he is. That makes me think of the Family Guy where Stewie is Saddam Hussein. He's got the same beard. Okay. He was a threat to the stability of the region. That video suggested that Iraq and Iran wanted him there, so they plotted to develop. Oh, we never found the nuclear weapons, though. I don't think. I think that was a meme about Bush. There has to be more to it. That's what I always feel like. Because from the population, in reports by soldiers, they usually are pretty positive.
I mean, it looked like there was one from some other source when you Googled it, but
I don't trust the Guardian, dude. History.com.
I mean, it's one of the more reputable, popular news sources compared to the other ones, but it's okay.
No. I don't trust any news source that's not History Channel. Well, okay, History Channel. Why? I just want to know what group it was. If I can find out what group it was, if there was one, then we will determine whether or not it was mandated. Because like you said, if there's allies that request it, then it makes sense. Because, let's see. Why did the U.S. invade Iraq? Okay, so it was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Who wanted Saddam Hussein out? I hate my... Okay, Red Dawn. It was all U.S. versus Saddam Hussein. Okay. You know, this is an interesting conflict. I know that the aftermath is what people usually say positively about the U.S.'s intervention, but had it not been caused by Saddam Hussein's background overthrowing, then I don't know.
By no means do I say that. Am I saying that Saddam Hussein was a good person, or what he did was good or justified, or even remotely okay by any stretch of the imagination?
I mean, so,
I
but
just
I'm
don't-
trying to support your sort of theory that we shouldn't have been involved, even if he was a bad guy, because I already said if there's evil out there, we should go out and stop it.
I
It's
I
not
just
like we
feel
took
like
over Iraq.
I know. I just feel like a lot of the time, like the U.S. tends to engage with other nations, especially those that maybe
Such
doesn't.
as,
Well, I mean, I am not giving like specifics right now. I'm just talking in general. Like the
in
U.S.
general, I know, but in general has to refer to something, you know? It's like, it's a feeling, it's more of a feeling that you have, but it's not backed by anything in particular. So it's like, oh, I think,
I mean, there are things
you
that you
know.
can look up if you're wondering, but
No, I know, but I know of several, like U.S. intervention in Guam, the Spanish-American War, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela, and U.S. intervention in Philippines. So, I think that's the Spanish-American War also, but these are all the situations that I can think of in particular that were instances where we didn't really need to go out of our way for these sorts of things.
mm-hmm.
And these are things that would definitely further your case, but I encourage you to have feelings that are at least, if what I'm trying to say is a lot of these things are based off of what we should and shouldn't do as a country, but you're describing what we shouldn't do based off of generalities, and it's difficult to tell us not to do something if we don't have no proof of such concept. And starting from the Spanish-American War, Kevin, this was something that was part of the Philippine Revolution, actually, and the Cuban War of Independence. So it was a lot of things that we should not have been a part of, such as, well, the Vietnam conflict. That's probably an obvious one, but reasons, BBC. Okay, interesting. I want to see what the Brits have to say about us. But there's a lot of instances where you could say that we should not have gone to war. But there are a lot of ones that I can also bring up where it's like, yeah, we should go to war. So it's hard to like make, at least in my own opinion, statements about whether or not the war was right or wrong, because it often feels like hindsight is much more appropriate, because of course the Iraq invasion was right after 9/11, so it was definitely a surge of patriotism, and that happens throughout our time and as a country of being the US. And so throughout that entire time, you know, it's like, maybe we shouldn't have gone to war with Britain to declare our independence. Maybe we'd be better off then. Maybe we shouldn't have had a civil war. You know, it's like, there are definitely wars you should have, but it's hard to say whether or not you should have them or not until it's, you know, said and done. Probably shouldn't have had the Vietnam War, probably should not have wasted resources on the Cold War, but I do appreciate that we went to space because of it. Probably shouldn't have done a lot of things, but you know, that's how I feel. And these are instances. The Philippine-American War, which is has to do with the U.S. and the Philippine Republic, which they declared war against the United States, which was due to what was the first paragraph say? I'm not sure. Arms conflict lasted from 1899 to 1902. So the U.S. government regarded it as an insurrection. The conflict arose when the First Philippine Republic objected to the terms of the Treaty of Paris, under which the United States took possession of the Philippines from Spain, ending the Spanish-American War. So this was after the Spanish-American War, which was another one that I brought up, which was the idea that it was at the same time as the Cuban Revolution, for independence and the Philippine Revolution. So Philippines wanted independence from Spain, and we helped them, but the Treaty of Paris was basically instated that we are now your vassal country, and you're our vassal state. And so they didn't want it, and so we went to war with them. Probably shouldn't have done that. And that's one of those things where I could definitely say it's like, was that a war that we should have sent troops for? No, definitely not. General MacArthur, probably the senior, actually. That's probably the father of the one in later wars. But yeah, and Vietnam War, Venezuelan crisis, which we put in a corrupt group after that, pretty much. Or maybe it wasn't Venezuelan, but one of the South American countries. I forget which one. I think it's Venezuela. But same thing with the Taliban. It's like not good stuff. Good in the short term, not good in the long term. And bloodless. Guam. We kept Guam, though, didn't we?
I think it's a territory or something, yeah.
And Puerto Rico, too. But if you wanted to say anything else, say your piece. Feel free, dude. I don't mean to try to disagree with you and tell you you're wrong, but
I mean, I already lost my train of thought, to be honest, so...
Good. Because this video, hopefully it's good. Maybe there's a shorter one. 24 minutes long. Let's see. Lawrence of Arabia. Not the movie. Legacy. Try this one out. But
T.E. Lawrence.
This is really interesting because this is one of the first sort of instances in the 20th century of using insurgent groups funded by a major power to overthrow another power indirectly.
Lawrence.
And that's
Perhaps
Lawrence
no
of
other
Arabia.
name from the First World War has the same almost myth-like status as Lawrence of Arabia, the modern Robin Hood with his tales of courage and adventure that remain in our imagination even today. And that's the man I'm going to talk about right now. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War bio special of Who Did What in World War I, today featuring Lawrence of Arabia. Thomas Edward Lawrence was born in Tremadog, Wales, August 16, 1888. Quite early in life, he developed an interest in medieval history and military fortifications, and would even choose military history and strategy as his field of expertise for his exams as a young man. In 1908, he joined the Oxford...
How come we don't have fields of expertise exams that we choose when we're young men? What would yours have been, Kevin?
I don't know. I was a pretty good trumpet player, but I don't
Master of Brass? The
Something.
Brasster? What would I have done? I would have chosen pharmaceutical engineering.
Oxford University Officers Training
Go to
Corps.
Oxford.
Britain did not practice conscription, so such corps gave students the chance to practice at least basic military training. In June 1909, having
So what that means is actually that at that time Britain was still under a monarchy-based military recruitment system, meaning the officers were all lords and the military was conscripted, but officers were all royalty or of noble families essentially, and they hadn't transferred over until a few years later, where anyone could become an officer because of obvious reasons, where only the nobility are allowed to be officers, and even the best or the worst nobility is clearly worse than any competent officer from the streets, you know.
recommended for a job in Palestine, he set off for the Ottoman Empire. But when Britain and the Empire found themselves on opposite sides of the Great War in 1914, Lawrence was assigned to Cairo and promoted to staff captain.
That's not a real photo of him, is it? That's
I mean, it looks like one to me.
like, that's gotta be the movie Lawrence of Arabia. That's the movie one. He was a sharp looking dude. Got a very stiff upper lip though. Is that him? Jesus.
Hey mate, that's not T.E. Lawrence. That's actually Peter O'Toole playing him in Lawrence of Arabia.
I knew it.
Okay, who are you?
Oh, sorry. My name is Nick Hodges from History Buffs. I'm reviewing historical movies all the time. I was just talking about the legendary Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
Drawing and printing, and also supervised the encoding of and secure Egypt. 400,000 men were needed. The Gallipoli campaign was a big drain for most of a year, and the expedition up the Tigris and the subsequent siege of Kut, with its multiple failed relief attempts, showed that something different and drastic was necessary to disrupt the Ottoman Empire. So the British High Commissioner in Egypt opened negotiation with Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, who wanted the creation of an Arab state that included the entire Arabian Peninsula, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. In return for British help, he would give Britain economic privileges. Thing is, Chief of Intelligence Sir Gilbert Clayton didn't want to make concrete concessions and had this to say: "We don't want a powerful and united Arabian kingdom, not under the Sharif or anyone else, if it is even possible." And what Britain, along with France and Russia, was planning was carving up the Middle East into spheres of interest after the war. The difference was he was ignored. What happened was an agreement that the Arabs would support the British in exchange for supplies and money. And to make the whole thing seem like a real Arab revolt, one major city must be taken, preferably Damascus. Lawrence was chosen to supervise the plan. So on June 5th, 1916, he set out with Near East expert Ronald Storrs to support the Arab revolt, which Hussein's sons had proclaimed against the Ottomans at Medina. They hadn't had much success so far, though, even against just local Turkish garrisons. Indeed, the population of Mecca was mostly pro-Turkish, and many Arabs began to desert, even in such early days. The British provided a heavy field battery, machine guns, 5,000 rifles, and 100,000 pounds worth of gold. But when Lawrence entered the camp of Faisal, one of Hussein's sons, he was underwhelmed. One company of Turks, firmly entrenched in open country, could have defied the entire army of them, and a pitched defeat would have ended the war by sheer horror. I concluded that the tribesmen were good for defense only. They were too free-minded to endure command or to fight in a team. A man who could fight well by himself made generally a bad soldier. His works proved prophetic, and you could really see the clash between modern and traditional attitudes. The Bedouins were courageous fighters, no question, but artillery and airplanes threw them into disarray. Lawrence rode and fought with Faisal's forces, and their aim was not to destroy the Turkish army, which they couldn't, but things like bridges and railways. Still, by the end of 1916, the Arab revolt was in full retreat. Faisal's and his brother Zaid's 2,000 men on the run as the Turks advanced on Yanbu. But there, British warships were at port and trenches were dug that could protect the city with machine gun emplacements. However, the Bedouins refused to get into the trenches and panic swept the city, though Faisal and Zaid managed to escape on the ships. The revolt needed an urgent success.
Oh, never mind. That was like Samuel Jackson on the right for a second there. Like, what is he doing? No. So the general or the Sharif guy just dipped.
Success. So, with the help of Lawrence and a lot of British money and guns, Faisal recruited 10,000 men to fight. With huge numerical superiority, they stormed a Turkish camp near Wag and even took and plundered the city itself. The guerrilla war also continued, mainly against the Hijaz Railway between Damascus and Medina. The main problem was that the revolt lacked support. There were, of course, intellectual circles that supported an independent Syria.
And so you get the idea. So that was another proxy. Like, I think that's probably my favorite example of a proxy war, just because of how Lawrence of Arabia has kind of reached this mythic status in terms of being the 20th century Robin Hood, leading the Bedouin rebels against the Ottomans. And Battlefield 1 has one of their side campaigns where he is like your mentor, Arabia, and you're this girl that's in a Bedouin group.
Raging years before I got to France. Tribes of Bedouins had united to fight a war.
It's great. I think the campaigns from Battlefield 1 are actually fantastic. I even bought my own freaking gas cape because of how cool one of the characters that kind of looked like John Wayne was.
Of a single influential warrior.
But let's see.
Change.
Okay. 1 second. You can't tell, but this is my gas cape.
There you go.
The Arabian Desert. A vast ocean of drifting sands and scorched, sun-baked rocks. Beneath these endless dunes, oil. The lifeblood of our new mechanical century. For more than 400 years, the Ottoman Empire has ruled these lands, controlling all that's to be found here. But the Ottomans do not rule unopposed. Small bands of Bedouin rebels have united to overthrow the empire. They strike without warning and then vanish into the desert. Fighting alongside them is a lone British officer whose exploits have earned him wide renown. The world has taken to calling this man Lawrence of Arabia. In the desert, you rely on good planning, but you also hope for a dash of luck. And luck was with us when we learned of a recently derailed Ottoman train carrying a most interesting piece of cargo.
You'll be free. Your scout tell you.
Free.
Free is it?
Enchant.
How enchanting you are, my dear.
I'll show you enchanting. If it weren't for you, I'd be free.
Free is it? You'll be free when you're
dead.
There
you go, sorry.
And I'm happy to tell you, the Empire intends to grant you all this freedom very soon.
General Dickbag.
Even now,
pretty
an
much.
engine of destruction scours this desert, obliterating your
So the final mission of the campaign is you have to take down their armored train.
Soon there will be nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide.
Hard from what I remember having to do in multiplayer.
Soon all that you
Yeah.
and all that you love will be ashes. You will all be free to die.
Oh.
Ah, you animal! Zara.
Didn't even kill him, just lightly slit his throat. Or his cheek? What?
Now, I
What kind of
understand
slitting?
that you would like nothing
Didn't
more
even
than
really
to
tell.
strip the flesh
Thought
from
it was
that
his
man's
neck.
feet and send him off into the desert naked to die.
Oh, cut
But
ear.
think about it. Your
I'm sorry. My friend here, she can be a little brusque.
You're going to tell me how to lie to your train, so we can lure it into a trap and destroy it.
Impossible. To even begin to talk to that train, you would need an entire book of communication code.
Alright, let's go find those communication codes.
An
And
so
so,
you'll have to stop to take on water. That's where we strike.
so Lawrence of Arabia. There you go. Destroy that thing. And so, you have to destroy it. Choo choo.
Obviously, probably didn't go exactly like this, but
You get to destroy a train. It's close enough to what actually happened. Of course, not actually what happened. They destroyed the train tracks, which is good enough. But yeah, so that's kind of the idea of proxy wars is a very interesting topic, especially when you bring up that question. It's like, do we dare intervene in some of these ones that we have no business in? And that's definitely something to consider, especially now that the population is much more educated on global issues, and we've traveled the world, we've seen how people live, and now more than ever people have a firm understanding of when or what is considered, unnecessary violence on behalf of our own self-interest. And so
I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily true.
You think that we're not smart enough to determine that? Or
I mean, I don't think it's that. I just don't think everybody has the same idea as to what's justified and what isn't.
No,
and everybody's
100%.
entitled to, have their opinion on that as well.
Yeah, and history is written by the victor, so...
That's true.
So, to make the victors be the best people possible for it. So what do you think about North Korea then? What if they start getting a little bit more kooky?
I mean, obviously that's kind of like a very volatile situation in general. I mean,
do you think deposing the Kim family and uncovering their human rights violations would not be okay for us to do?
I mean, I don't specifically know what the military situation is in South Korea, and surrounding areas, so I don't really know how effective their ability to defend themselves against North Korea, which is obviously a very strong nation, reportedly.
What I'm asking is, definitely, I mean, in terms of defense, would you agree that it would be justifiable to send troops to aid South Korea?
I mean, I'm pretty sure we're allied with South Korea, aren't we? So, I mean, if they requested help, I mean, I don't see... That's not really a proxy war. They asked for aid, so...
And so, what about in the situation where the human rights violations of North Korea become more and more apparent? Do you think we should intervene then, or wait until that an ally is attacked?
I mean, I feel like that's kind of...
Or how do you see it? How do you interpret it?
I mean, I feel like somebody needs to be doing something to try to right the wrong, obviously. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily the United States' responsibility to deal with that, obviously. I think that, like I said, I don't really specifically know what the situation in regards to the countries surrounding North Korea are in regards to being able to do something about it themselves. I just don't necessarily know if the U.S., which tends to have a paternalistic attitude in regards to certain things, in regards to international relations, I don't know if that's necessarily the most effective means to deal with it.
If China came in to depose the Kim family, that'd be preferred.
I mean, I feel like it's a different framework that we maybe operate from. A lot of, I feel like Eastern Asian countries maybe operate in a similar manner versus, the United States, not necessarily a similar culture entirely. So, I mean, I suppose maybe it would be a different situation. But I mean, I can't really speak on that. I don't really have like a whole lot of familiarity with the specifics of, you know.
No, I understand.
The sort of
understand.
conflict going on.
I understand what you're saying too, and that's a very reasonable thing to say. Of course, our influence on outside worlds is not always the best influence, especially with cultural differences or social differences. And so, if North Korea prefers to be one way, then they have every right to decide that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously,
assuming that the dictatorship gets overthrown and there's
right.
a power vacuum.
I just don't. I mean, I feel like a lot of the time when a world power, decide, like, after it does like a coup or something, and removes somebody from office, and then they end up putting somebody else into that position. I don't feel like that really helps the people that are in that country, because if it's a foreign power that's instating somebody into that seat of power, how can they really know for sure and say for sure that that's representative of what the people wanted and not just what that power said was the best option?
Was Kim Jong-il put in place because he overthrew
I mean, his father was also the leader before him.
Who was it?
Kim Jong-suk, I think, or something.
Sung. So he was put in 1948. Was he put in by Stalin?
I actually don't know too much about North Korea past him, to be honest.
I want to say, because there was some famous leader of Korea that was overthrown by him. So Stalin pretty much funded it. Korean War, obviously. But like if Kim Il-sung, Mao Zedong, Stalin, crazy stuff.
I mean,
but my point in bringing this up was like the original people that were placed in power were put in by Soviet influence, so it was obviously a move to spread communism to the rest of Asia in addition to China. And so
yeah, I mean, I guess from the get-go it was a proxy war set forth by another world power.
So like, okay, so that leads me to another question. Where do you think a lot of these countries stand that are on either side of a proxy war? Like, for example, Iraq and Korea.
What do I think?
Like, what do you think their role is in this tug of war? Like, whoever is the rope that's being tugged by like these huge powers. Like,
I mean,
obviously, obviously, you'd want them to retain their independence and
right,
speak on behalf of themselves. But
I just feel like, I mean, to an extent, I mean, obviously North Korea is kind of like an outlier because it's sort of become this country that's so powerful in and of itself. Everybody thinks of North Korea as one of the most like I said, volatile, just like hotbeds of potential. Like, anything could happen any day. Like, he could just decide to go to war with near anybody, at like a moment's notice, it seems like a lot of the time. But I think that in other situations, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. I mean, I just tend to believe that a lot of the time, the country, I mean, well, I guess it really depends, because over time, obviously, a country, as you said, that's like independent, has its sort of like maybe sovereignty to a certain degree. Like, I feel like it'll sort of, like I said, develop its own culture and its own sort of identity, and like nationalistic, patriotic attitude. And as such, maybe initially it would, stand on the side of the country that initially put it in place, because obviously it's sort of representative of the belief systems of that prior group, or something similar. But at the same time, like I said, over time it will probably naturally develop its own identity, unless that other power is still controlling it from afar, which is obviously what happens in a lot of proxy wars. The countries aren't directly involved necessarily, but they have their fingers in it and are sort of like pulling the strings from the outside.
Yeah, because if Soviet Union placed them in power, then I wonder how their relationship with Russia is now.
I mean, it was saying, obviously during the Korean War that, they were siding together, but, I don't know how it's been since then, obviously.
The fall of the USSR, I don't know. I mean, Putin's he's a KGB gangster, but I don't know if he was so into socialism as his predecessors.
I don't know.
So, the collapse of the Soviet Union, definitely, they pulled back support a lot.
Russia did?
Mm-hmm. A 56% decrease, so they've been trading less and less.
That's a pretty significant reduction in support. But they're still giving them something. What does that mean?
Yeah. It does mean something, you're right.
Everything means something.
Interesting. Well, that's a very, very hot topic. That I didn't think we would find as much stuff as we did, but it's just opened a lot of more questions, like who's pointing guns at who. I wonder if I feel like there's some ultimate standoff where people just start pulling off was that like a
Ultimate
Rocket
Showdown
Jump
of Ultimate Destiny?
Oh my god! I don't know if we should play that right now or wait to use it as our intro for next week. Oh my gosh.
You can do that next week.
Oh my god. Albino Black Sheep, freaking E-Bombs World, dude.
Classic stupid shit video. I remember that one.
Alright, well, here's a preview for next week. We kind of ran over on this topic, but it was a hot one, so maybe we'll bring in the concept of war crimes and what that implicates in addition to these next week. But here's a little preview for our intro. Oh my gosh, do I just play the freaking end?
As far as the eye can see, and only one will survive. I wonder who it will be. This is the ultimate showdown. This is the ultimate showdown. This is the ultimate showdown. Ultimate destiny.
All right, well, be sure to tune in next week for some hot topics that we will also bring up and heated discussions with respectable rooms for both anyone to discuss. And this has been the Burning Bush Podcast, and we both have a history of going to religious schools in our youth, and we all both know about stories of the Bible, so that's where this title comes from, and we always try to tie it into religious aspects of life and tie it into the world as a whole. So I guess the theme of today was the never-ending conflict in the Middle East.
That has been going on continuously since biblical times, in different forms, one way or another.
Well, thank you.